Okay, let's dive straight into this explainer and unpack the rapidly shifting security dynamics in Northern Europe. Right now, there is a massive transformation happening along one of the world's absolute most critical geopolitical fault lines. We're going to break down exactly what the latest data and recent developments are actually telling us. We'll be looking at the hard numbers, the political rhetoric, and the on-the-ground tactical realities of Russia's expanding military footprint.
And this single geographic fact really sets the stakes for our entire analysis today. When we talk about this border, we aren't just talking about a line drawn on a map, right? We are talking about NATO's longest direct point of contact with Russia. This incredible stretch of land is where the abstract concept of international security meets the very real physical presence of military forces. Everything we cover today flows directly from the strategic vulnerability of this specific geography.
So, let's look at the hard data. Section 1, the physical buildup and expanding facilities.
The sheer scale of the increase projected by Finnish Army Commander Pasi Välimäki is honestly staggering. Previously, the true presence facing Finland was estimated at around 20,000, but now that number is expected to completely skyrocket to 80,000. And if we zoom out just a bit to the wider NATO frontier, covering the Nordic and Baltic regions, that potential force rises to a massive 115,000 soldiers. We are literally watching the emergence of a permanent Russian military force right on the eastern frontier.
Now, you might be wondering, where are they putting all these people? Well, Moscow is actively rebuilding and expanding 19 different facilities across its northwestern region. Up on the Kola Peninsula, the Pashenka facility alone is expected to gain the capacity to house 17,000 troops. That's essentially a small city of soldiers. Further south, we're seeing major developments in Kandalaksha and the reactivation of the Petrozavodsk garrison, which is being specifically developed to support units of the 44th Army Corps operating near Finland. This physical footprint gives Russia exactly the space it needs to sustain this massive force.
Moving on to Section 2, a new rhetorical pretext and political justifications.
Because as the physical infrastructure grows, we have to examine the political rhetoric accompanying it. Back in April, Russian Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu made a pretty intense claim. He alleged that Ukrainian drones were approaching Russia through Finland and the Baltic states, and warned that Moscow could invoke self-defense if these countries were deliberately allowing their airspace to be used. Now, regional governments firmly reject these claims, and independent sources haven't established these flight paths. But the framing here, that's absolutely crucial to pay attention to.
Things heated up even more recently after Finland temporarily restricted aviation and maritime traffic over the eastern Gulf of Finland. Finnish authorities were crystal clear. This was purely a precaution against stray drones, and no drones actually entered their airspace. However, Moscow spun these very precautions as proof of a Ukrainian air corridor. They're actively portraying Finland as a participant in attacks on Russian territory, using this narrative of supposed Finnish aggression to justify their own localized buildup.
Which brings us to Section 3, the combat-tested force.
So who is actually going to populate these expanding garrisons?
Here's the catch. Moscow doesn't need to build a brand new army from scratch. They can simply pivot an already seasoned force. Once the current war concludes, the returning Russian units will bring years of brutal, combat-tested battlefield experience with them. By transferring these specific formations northwest, the Kremlin preserves their combat readiness. That means Finland wouldn't just be facing a large force, but a highly experienced one that has literally spent years adapting its tactics in modern warfare.
Let's look at how those tactics might play out in Section 4, asymmetry in the skies. To really understand the tactical vulnerability here, we can look at a recent assessment from the Baltic Defense Initiative. They ran a hypothetical scenario they call a stress test. Basically, they asked, what happens if drone saturation and long-range strikes are used to rapidly blind and weaken regional air defenses before larger allied forces can even arrive? Now, to be clear, this is a hypothetical exercise, not a leaked invasion plan, but it perfectly highlights the immense pressure a sudden opening attack could put on Western defenses.
And this comparison hits the nail on the head. It's the ultimate asymmetric nightmare. Dirt cheap, mass-produced drones forcing defenders to burn through scarce multi-million-dollar interceptor missiles. If Moscow applies the lessons learned from recent conflicts, this puts severe pressure on Western air defenses. It exposes a really harsh mathematical reality of modern combat. Europe would struggle to quickly replace its sophisticated missile stocks during a prolonged saturation-style conflict.
And that math problem gets even more complicated in Section 5, NATO's assembly gap.
Because right now, the alliance is literally still in the process of assembling the permanent forces meant to defend its eastern members. Take Germany's permanent 45th Armored Brigade in Lithuania, for example. It's a key part of the defense strategy, but it doesn't reach full operational capability until the end of 2027. This delay, combined with those limited interceptor stocks we just talked about, creates a really uncomfortable window. It's a gap that could theoretically encourage Russian commanders to gamble against local defenses before NATO can fully reinforce the area.
Zooming out from the immediate tactics, we arrive at Section 6, the strategic long game.
Even if a tank never crosses that border, simply turning it into a permanently militarized zone is a massive strategic win for Moscow. Defending NATO's longest direct border with Russia is unbelievably expensive. It demands the permanent deployment of air defenses, 24/7 continuous surveillance systems, and a massive footprint of ground forces and logistics. Over time, this locks NATO into a costly buildup. It allows Moscow to effectively drain alliance resources simply by keeping the threat alive and present right on the doorstep.
So, as Moscow physically prepares its forces, expands its bases, and hones its political messaging, we are left with a pretty sobering question. Will this long-term strategy of constant, localized pressure on the Finnish border ultimately exhaust the alliance's resources? We really have to ask ourselves, before a single shot is even fired, has the economic war of attrition already begun?